You know that you're expected to use metaphors in your descriptive narrative piece. However, are they any good? And how straightforward do you find it coming up with decent ones? This video will help you to reflect on how to use more successful metaphors in your writing and avoid limp rubbish. Stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare.
Let's start with a definition. Rather than say it's a simile without the like or as, or that it is when you state something is something else, how about this video will contain 10 examples of metaphors for you to mull over. As with my video on personification, I will reference metaphors used by some of my past pupils and compare those with metaphors used in Hudson River, bracketed by dear Edith Wharton. Can you believe that I was standing outside the house she lived in Paris as recently as February, before this coronavirus pandemic really got going? Happier days. So, here are the first two metaphors. Which one do you find more convincing and why? Time to jot down a few notes and press pause. The video will resume in 5 seconds time. Let's take the first one first. I think the use of anadiplosis within the second sentence makes it more effective. The second sentence is dramatically short for effect and aims to highlight just how confined and miserable the narrator feels within the house. It makes him feel as though life is worthless, has no value. The trouble is, since qualifying as a teacher 15 years ago, I must have seen or heard this metaphor hundreds of times. Yes, in a strange way, the more makes the sentence more effective, adding a realistic degree of clarification. Still, it's not brilliant. What did you make of this metaphor and the sentence as a whole? The metaphor is, of course, the mist of distress, and I love the more subtle suggestiveness of this phrase. Crucially, a mist is a thin fog produced by very small drops of water, and so it is clear that the woman is becoming tearful, and this is resulting in glimpses of condensation appearing on her face. What I like here is the fact that it is only implicitly referring to a small quantity of tears. Hearing all the time about floods or storms of tears can get tedious. Time for two more delicious metaphors, dear viewers, subscribers, and not forgetting you pupils. Which one do you prefer, and god damn it, why? Pause time. Let's take the two in order once again. There is no doubt that the effectiveness of a metaphor can frequently depend on its wider context beyond the individual sentence. So let me give you a brief insight into who he is and why he feels so dazed. He is Vance Weston, married to Laura Lou. However, he shares an extraordinary intellectual and emotional chemistry with Halo Tarrant, who is married to Lewis Tarrant. What has just happened is that Halo Tarrant has responded to Vance's passionate declaration of love by pointing out that she wouldn't be able to leave her husband and that he wouldn't be able to leave his wife. During this declaration of love, Vince was simply thinking of the moment, not of any possible future consequences. And so it dawns on him that Halo is absolutely right. Leave Laura Lou? No, of course he couldn't. What nonsense. There was nobody else to look after her. The first sentence contains a simile rather than a metaphor. This simile suggests that he feels mangled, disorientated, breathless and trapped by the sudden realization of his situation. And the metaphor? Well, this suggests his slow reanimation to life and realities. Note the subject of the sentence. It is not Vance, but the sluggish current which is forcing itself into his veins, emphasising his own impotence. He has been figuratively injected with a preset course of life to follow, which leaves him writhing and weak beneath his own powerlessness. Why do I like this metaphor so much? As ever, it's often the small details that can make all the difference. And I like the use of the adjective sluggish. I suspect we all know what it means, but for some reason I very rarely come across it when marking my pupils' work. So using a more unusual adjective before the image adds greater interest, as does the fact that there is an oxymoronic feel to the phrase sluggish currents. When we think of currents, we think of fast-flowing streams or electrical charges. Sluggish is unexpected in this context and emphasises the way that Vance is slowly awakening to a torpid, stultifying reality. And what of the second metaphor? Any good? Well, the first point I would make is that it is grammatically incomplete. There is no main verb within this sentence. This doesn't necessarily matter as long as the pupil knows he or she has done this and have done it for effect, e.g. to emphasise the stark isolation of his old house. There are two metaphors in this sentence: a proud survivor and a gem. The first metaphor implies that around the house there may have been difficulties and conflict. Perhaps other nearby houses have been knocked down or fallen into disrepair, making the fact that this house is still standing more powerful and impressive. Meanwhile, gem highlights the preciousness of the house. Perhaps it is worth a great deal of money. Perhaps it figuratively shines and sparkles amidst its more prosaic, depressing surroundings. I have to say that these metaphors remind me of Daphne du Maurier's description of the country home Manderley within her best-selling novel Rebecca, which was first published in 1938. She writes, "There was Manderley, our Manderley, secretive and silent, as it had always been, the grey stone shining in the moonlight of my dream, the mullion windows reflecting the green lawns and the terrace. Time could not wreck the perfect symmetry of those walls, nor the site itself, a jewel in the hollow of a hand." Of course, the metaphor is the reference to a jewel in the hollow of a hand, which suggests the house's sparkling preciousness, but also that its scale is tiny within the overall scheme of things, and that the surrounding area is on slightly higher land. Beautiful, as is the almost poetic repetition of Manderley within the previous sentence, and the sibilant description of it being secretive and silent. So how effective are these metaphors? They're okay. A little simple, perhaps. Two more, and one of them is a cracker. It's pause time. Let's reverse the order and talk about the second one first. The intention here is to highlight just how busy the morning commute is. There are so many people. It is almost as though they merge into one mass, into one seamless sea. Reasonably effective, although I would say the metaphor "a sea of" is used a lot. There are also minor issues with the rest of the sentence. For instance, there's the confusing use of the subject "one" and the subsequent determinant "there", whilst the use of the adjective woeful seems a little too explicit and overstated. I would prefer to work it out for myself that their officers are woeful rather than being told it so blandly. And the first metaphor, it is, of course, the X-ray of her settled indifference. Isn't this brilliant? Now that the wife is indifferent towards her husband, she has developed the ability to see minutely into every aspect of him. It is as though she can now see through all his layers and fronts, and interestingly, not because she loves him and therefore knows him so well, but because she is now apathetic towards him. We're motoring through these metaphors. See what I did there? 2 more for you. Pause time. Let's take the first one first. Plenty of ambition in the sentence. We have some slightly more complex words. Scrumptious, aroma and nutrition, for instance. To quote dimwit Sir Andrew from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, what's your metaphor? It suggests that the kitchen is the workhouse of our meals. Just a reminder about what a workhouse is or was. Thus, the implication is that the kitchen is a place of extraordinary, relentless hard work. Those within there are depriving themselves so that others can feast, perhaps. What do you think of this metaphor? Well, my problem is that I find the sentence as a whole slightly confusing and clunky. The metaphor is positioned towards the end of the sentence as the object. However, there are 3 objects: the source of our nutrition, the workhouse of our meals, the kitchen. We know what the writer is trying to do here, but is the sentence and meaning sufficiently clear? No issues with clarity with this one. A neat subordinate clause surrounded by dashes, and repeated use of water imagery within the tidal wave of delusion, and dull backwater of her marriage. I really like the idea of developing and extending imagery. Don't just use one simile or metaphor on a certain theme, use 2 or more. Here's the reference to the tidal wave of delusion emphasises the overpowering monumental strength of Halo's inaccurate surmises. She was extraordinarily way off the mark. Subsequently, she has found herself within a stagnant, staid marriage, comparatively devoid of life. If the water isn't moving, it is far less likely to be sustaining, living, vibrant organisms. Note also how the metaphors are about 2 very different topics, her inaccurate feelings and her marriage, yet are linked within the same sentence. Powerful and effective. Goodness me, are we on to the last 2 already? Get ready for the last time to read them through and jot down some intelligent thoughts. Press pause now. Both of these refer either implicitly or explicitly to hunger. Let's look at the first one. Pretty harsh, isn't it? The metaphor is seen in the suggestion that his father is a lifeless corpse, which could imply all kinds of things. The son's hatred, perhaps wish fulfillment, the lack of colour within his father's complexion, his comparative lack of movement, his disgusting decaying-like smell. Certainly interesting and quite powerful. Now on to number 2, which has 2 metaphors. The first one refers to the extraordinary volume of traffic. It is overwhelming and uncontrollable and simply doesn't cease. Does the use of the unusual adjective turbid stop this metaphor being a little dull and cliched? Meanwhile, the second metaphor refers to the complex network of routes and paths within the city. Crucially, the use of arteries emphasises the interconnected unity of the roads as a whole. They all make up a larger whole. Additionally, we know that when arteries get clogged and congested, the chance of a heart attack and stroke is significantly increased. Thus, the metaphor emphasises the essential unhealthiness of the city and its longer-term lack of viability.
As a final thought on metaphors, I thought you might like to hear a brief extract from the Cole Porter song You're the Top, taken from the 1934 musical Anything Goes, in which the singers use an extraordinary number of metaphors to complement each other. The effect is both comic and perhaps touching. Many thanks for watching.